Today, I'll be sharing the steps you can take to make your own apple vinegar. This time of year, I'm making a lot of things out of apples. There's always cores and peels and other scraps that I'm not going to use to make whatever I'm cooking. And so I make those into what's called an apple scrap vinegar. Hi, I'm Allison from The Well Cultivated Life, and I'm an herbalist. And as an herbalist, I use a lot of vinegars for different types of extracts. Vinegar is such a wonderful medium for making herbal extracts because it has the living probiotic qualities to it. Buying quarts and quarts of vinegar can get kind of expensive. So I started making my own fruit scrap vinegar instead of throwing these scraps into the compost pile. Sorry, chickens, you're not getting the apple scraps anymore. You too can learn to make your own apple vinegar. It is super easy to do. Now I'm saying apple vinegar because this isn't technically apple cider vinegar. We're not starting with cider. We're starting with the peels and the cores of the apple, the things that would normally be just thrown away. You don't have to be an herbalist to do this. You can just use them for salad dressings and marinades and anything that you might use in your kitchen. Once you start doing this, you're going to be looking at all of your fruit scraps very differently and experimenting around to see what different flavors you can get from different types of fruits. So to kick things off, you want to grab your apple core peeler slicer. Did you say you've never used one of those? You have got to get one. It slices, it peels, it cores, and it makes it super easy to set aside the cores and the peels so that you can put them into your vinegar. Once you have your apple scraps, and this can include any types of apples. This apple I found in the fruit bowl that kind of got forgotten, and it's a little punky, and I don't really want to eat it, but I can throw that in for my vinegar. This apple core peeler and slicer is one of the most fantastic kitchen gadgets you can have. It's an essential for any kitchen that likes to make a lot of apple goodies. You simply just place the apple onto the spindle, crank it through, and it hits this slicing tool. It begins to peel off the skin while it pushes it through this corer piece right here and slices the apple into these exact width slices. It is so wonderful for making any type of baked apples because you don't have to spend a lot of time slicing everything up. There was a point when mine broke and I didn't have one, and I thought, oh, well, this isn't a big deal. I can just slice these by hand. Oh my word, it was so much more work. Now, once you have sliced up several apples, and when I'm making something, I always like to use a couple different variety of apples as possible. One of the things I've found about using this is that the colder the apples, the better off they are. When they warm up, they get too mushy and they break off. So again, here's my apple slice. And my beautiful peels, my core, and this little piece kind of broke off, so I'm going to go ahead and stick that in to the vinegar making as well. Once you have your apple scraps all set aside, it's time to start the vinegar making process. You're going to want to use a very clean jar to make your vinegar. I always sterilize my jars with boiling water just to be on the safe side. We're inviting wild yeasts and bacteria to come in and perform the fermentation process for us. And so we want to make sure that that's all we get in our jar. We don't want any other types of molds or anything else if we can help it. Of course, the easiest thing to use is just a regular canning jar. You can use a quart or a half gallon, depending on how many scraps you have. Simply place the peels and the cores and any other kind of funky apple parts, as long as they're not moldy, into the jar and cover it with water. You're not going to want to fill the jar full because during the fermentation process, the apples are going to be expanding. There's going to be fizzing and bubbling as the bugs do their jobs. So don't fill it more than 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the way full, so that you have room for that. So I've got some apple scraps here now. I'm simply going to put them into a jar. I don't need to mush them up or anything. They're going to just completely disintegrate in the jar. That's just core and peels from 3 apples gave me almost a half a jar. You can make a lot of cider vinegar from the peels from 1 apple pie. So the next step is just simply to add some water. You want to make sure that you're using either a filtered water or at the very least a water that is free from any kind of chlorine. And I'm just going to kind of poke these down in here. I have a filtered tap here. And notice how I'm only filling this about 3/4 of the way full. And since I'm just using 1 quart, I'm only going to add 2 tablespoons of sugar to this jar here. The sugar is just some food for the bugs to be able to munch on, and it gets your ferment going a lot faster. The first step is going from sugar to alcohol, and there's a couple other steps before it transitions all the way to vinegar. And so by getting this going faster with sugar, that's what the alcohol fermentation is, the conversion of sugar to alcohol, then you're just going to speed up your whole process. One of the most important things you need to do when you start making concoctions in the kitchen is, of course, put a label on everything. And in particular, because we are fermenting this for a period of time, we want to make sure we put the date on this here. So I'll just put apple scrap vinegar in today's date. Stick that right on my jar. Like that, so I can keep track of it. And I'm going to be stirring it every day for the first week or 2, checking it to make sure it's fizzing. And when it stops fizzing, adding my second half of my sugar. But now it's good to just go on the shelf and begin its fermentation journey. Some people will use a coffee filter over the top, but I found that just using a folded in half paper towel works really great. You just simply put that over the top and then take the ring from your jar without the lid part and just put that over, and that seals it very nicely. I can watch the fruit flies land on it and nobody's getting in. For the first couple of weeks, you want to stir your mixture at least every other day. And what you'll find is that as you stir, it stirs up all of the CO2 that's being given off by the critters that are converting the sugar to alcohol. Once you find that as you stir, it's no longer fizzing, you can add the other half of the sugar to your jar. So at the beginning, if you're doing a quart, you're going to add 2 tablespoons. And then once it stops fizzing, you add another 2 tablespoons of sugar. Stir that daily until it stops fizzing. And then you can just let it sit and let the rest of the process go on its own. After about 30 days, you can check the pH of the vinegar to see if it is acidic enough to filter and bottle. I use these handy dandy pH strips here. They're easy, and we're not trying to get an exact number. Some people who are more into it will get a pH meter. You can just get them on Amazon if that's what you want, but these are easy. You just stick them in and it will show you the color, and then you compare the color with the chart here. And what we want is we want to be below 4 on our pH scale. The lower the number, the more acidic the liquid or whatever you're measuring is. Once your pH is down low enough, then it's time to filter out all the solids and store the vinegar. You can use a fine mesh strainer, but what I find is that the apples break down into almost like a fine applesauce consistency. So something even finer than just a strainer on its own. A strainer with cheesecloth is what I usually use to make sure I'm getting out most of the solids. If you're watching this video, you probably have purchased apple cider vinegar with the mother in it, and that is why you're interested in making your own. So during the 30-day period, you may get one of these SCOBYs, that there's another name for it in vinegar as well, that forms over the top of the vinegar, and that's okay. This last batch of vinegar that I did, I decided to test, because I am a scientist at heart. I decided to test to see whether or not it made a difference if I added some SCOBY from another vinegar that I had into the jar. I had 2 jars going, and so I added it to one. I didn't add it to the other. I saw that it made no difference at all. I think that adding the sugar is the most beneficial thing that you can do to ensure that you're kickstarting your vinegar making process. Your vinegar is not going to come out completely clear, but if you don't like the amount of sediment that you end up with after you filter it, you can just let it settle in the jar and then decant off the top of it, then discard the sediment so that you have a more clear vinegar. The next step is to store your vinegar and, of course, to make some delicious things from it. One thing you need to note, though, is it's not recommended to do any actual pickling or canning where you're going to be sealing jars and just keeping them on the shelf, because the pH of this homemade vinegar is not necessarily stable. For that, you'd want to get a store or purchased vinegar. Usually people use white vinegar for that. But for anything else, your marinades, your salad dressings, and even making some herbally infused vinegars, the homemade apple vinegar is perfectly fine. Let me give you a piece of advice. Store your vinegar in a wide mouth jar. Last year I made some vinegar and I did an herbal infusion, and then I put it into one of these old vinegar jars with a narrow neck like this, and it got pushed to the back of the cupboard, and sure enough, a giant SCOBY formed on top of it. What I had to do to try to get this SCOBY out, luckily my husband finally figured out we could hook it out with a piece of wire. Your vinegar is alive, and that's what makes it so great and so healthful. It has the living bacteria in there. They're going to continue to eat and ferment and grow. You're way better off using a wide mouth canning jar. Glass is your best friend when you are making and storing vinegars. It does not react with the acidity of the vinegar, and it's the best thing for storing. The lids, canning jar lids, are metallic and they can get corroded by the vinegar. So one thing you can do is put a layer of parchment paper between the lid and the vinegar itself, or you can use a plastic bag or something like that that just gives an extra layer of protection between the vinegar and the lid so you don't get corrosion. I have opened up a jar only to see like rust falling into my vinegar in the past, so you want to avoid that if you can. Here's my final beautiful quart of vinegar. It does have a beautiful scent to it and taste. And one of the things you can use if you're worried about the corrosion of the lids is these reusable plastic mason jar tops. I use these all the time for when I make cheese and keep them in the fridge. They're super handy. They are not spill proof, so you don't want to be shaking your vinegar or anything while you're using one of these, because it will leak out of the top. So thanks so much for joining me for this vinegar tutorial. I hope you will save your scraps next time you're making something from apples. And you could use pear scraps. You can use any other type of fruit scrap as well to make your own homemade vinegar. Thanks so much for joining me. Be sure to like and subscribe if you got value from this video, and put a comment down below. Have you made your own vinegar? Do you have any other tips for people who are learning to make their own vinegar at home? Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Allison from The Well Cultivated Life. Take care. Bye-bye.